Everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the first public Activating Our Archives talk that we've done. Activating Our Archives is in its third year now, and we started in 2019 with a project that was kind of devised by Modern Art Oxford to run alongside Akram Zatari's exhibition at the time, which was called The Script. At the time, I was commissioned to run a public participation program, which I created in reference to Akram's work, but also in relationship to my own work, which is very much kind of rooted in using found photographs, archives, and family pictures. And I wanted to kind of create a project which kind of responded to the art that was showed in the galleries. And so Activating Our Archives was born. We had that year, we had something around 20 participants, and we ran a set of workshops. We had a few events, and we had an exhibition at the end, a one-day exhibition, which we called This Image Is Not Available. And the idea was to kind of really try and kind of question the nature of what archives were and how they could be used to kind of, or repurposed to tell new stories. And to explore basically photography and its kind of possibilities, and how those possibilities in the kind of contemporary moment were kind of expanding into the kind of digital arena and online and through social media and these kind of platforms. So it's very much about questioning the nature of photography and questioning how it was kind of evolving in the moment. So last year we ran Activating Our Archives again, and this time we partnered with an organisation called Fusion Arts, and Fusion Arts are hosting this event for us today. Fusion Arts are an organisation of community arts that is based here in Oxford, and through their facilities we hope to run practical workshop sessions on their premises, utilising the studios there and also the dark room. But then last year we had COVID, and because of the pandemic, we had to run everything online. So one aspect of running things online was that we didn't need people to be local to Oxford, and so we managed to get a lot more interest from other parts of the world too for the project. And also, I think we're coming at the moment, we're coming to a time when a lot more kind of collaboration and collective working is happening in arts and in photography as well. Social practice and social engagement within art organizations and institutions is becoming more and more prominent. More and more kind of resources are being fed that way. And so as artists, we find ourselves working with people more, which I think is only a good thing. And so last year we ran only online version of this, and that was quite successful as well. And again, when we came to this year, we decided to sort of try and run some kind of online component in addition to the actual physical workshops that we're holding at Fusion Arts. I'll say a little bit more about that later, because some of you I know who are not local to Oxford or are not on the programme at the moment, there'll be a way to get involved with this year's Activating Our Archives through our shared collaboration tool that we're using, which is Google's Padlet. So this year we set up the event to run in collaboration in concert with Samson Kambalu's exhibition at Modern Art Oxford, which is called New Liberia. And we, or at least developed a theme for it around protest and play. So I'm just going to read out the concept for this year's Activating Our Archives. So Activating Our Archives for 2021 places focus on protest and play as ways in which personal expression can help us move through life. Into a second year of COVID, with a world still in the grip of turmoil and tragedy, we have had to adapt our lives to what has been termed a new normal. The conditions of COVID and the restrictions of our freedoms and movements have heightened a sense of the biopolitics at play across societies, and this has further highlighted the injustices that people face. This has been reflected in the growing number of public protests we've witnessed in the past year, but also revealed a serious need for retreat and a search for individual freedom and joy. So in addition to becoming more politically active, we've also become in desperate need to seek new forms of expression, especially through play and playfulness. These seemingly opposite activities are in fact two sides of the same coin when we appreciate a pronounced need to assert our individuality and presence in the world. These outpourings of expression and emotion are vital as our collective contained and monitored selves release and reclaim our feelings in order to feel free again. So in many ways, Samson's work kind of responds to this. I think it's only on for another week or two at Modern Art Oxford, but some of it can be viewed online through the Modern Art Oxford's website. So I do urge you to have a look at that. But really what we wanted to try and do this year was to try and reflect on the past year with the participants through the use of images, through material photographs, as well as digital images, and to help kind of build stories and perspectives that kind of reflect this last year. And some of those could be very much linked to the idea of protest. Some of them could be completely linked to the idea of play, but whereas I see, as I've mentioned, the ideas of protest and play are a lot more closely linked than we might imagine. But today I've invited Sim Chi Yin to join us. Sim Chi Yin is a Magnum photographer and an artist based in Singapore, based in Berlin actually, and she's going to talk to us about her new book, which is a self-published book called She Never Rode That Tree Shore Again. I'd like to say hello to Chi Yin. Hi, Chi Yin.
Hi, Sunil.
Hi. So I know you're going to give us an overview of your work, but before that, you're going to give us a performance reading as well. So I'll just hand over the stage to you. So yeah, please do.
Okay, thanks, Sunil, and thanks for having me here, and thanks to the two organizations involved in organizing this, and hello to everyone. Well, we're gonna sort of go through this project that I've been sort of wrestling with for the past 8 or 9 years, and it's a multi-chapter project, so we're just going to look at a couple of chapters just because it's too much otherwise. And the most efficient way of doing this, I find, is to for me to do a series of readings, and then we can maybe have a discussion afterwards. So just a caveat that these readings are usually done in a theatrical setting, with different kinds of acoustics and different kind of theatrical lighting. So I'm delivering it in this form via Zoom, and the effect may be completely different from what you might experience in a theater. So just bear with us for that. I'm just going to share the screen now, and I'm going to do a series of readings, and afterwards we can pick up the conversation. Just one sec. Dear Irene, sorry I haven't written before this, old girl, but I'm afraid I've been a very busy man these last few months. Once I had successfully landed out here, I thought I'd be able to sit back and take things easy. But such has not been the case. People have been killed in recent weeks, and also a number of villages and police posts have been shot up by these Chinese bandits, or communist insurgents as they are also referred to. Yesterday and the day before, we had our first service fatalities, 2 officers and 8 men. And full-scale combined military and police action has now been going on for about the last 2 weeks, with fully armed RAF support. As we have now been put on active service, I suppose it's war. What fun. I had always imagined that it was warm in the tropical jungle. But at night, though we made leaf shelters and wore all our clothes, we shook with cold beneath our sodden ground sheets. And in the mornings, our faces would be so swollen with the bites of mosquitoes and sandflies that we had to bathe them in cold water before we could even open our eyes. Worst of all were the leeches. Every night, we had to remove some dozens of these revolting, bloated creatures from the most tender parts of our bodies. And apart from the irritation of the bites, the loss of blood was considerable. Looking down from the top of the mountain, what appeared in front of my eyes was not a sea of admiral green, but a desert of lifeless brown. The oppressive heat and the particularly deadening silence made me lose my instinctive need for even a glass of water. I was engulfed by a disappointment with nature's seeming coldness and heartlessness. But nature could not be heartless. All of a sudden, one gust after another of clear wind blew at us, disbanding our tiredness and chasing away the dead silence. The entire mountain in that single moment became alive. The lifeless brown returned to enticing emerald green. The sea of forests at our feet became a sea of undulating waves. Their sound, that of 1,000 horses and 10,000 troops gallantly advancing, spurred on by the majestic music of a march. Colonialism is a term which suggests a state of affairs in respect of non-self-governing territories which is derogatory and which ought to be superseded as soon as possible. It implies tutelage of one people by another. It suggests the right of one people to govern another. It means a condition of indignity imposed on a subject people. It often involves exploitation for material advantage of the controlling nation and a political and economic domination which is not only inconsistent with freedom, but also destructive of self-respect. The term colonialism, as applied to those territories in the British Commonwealth where the United Kingdom government has a direct responsibility for defense and internal security, and for the maintenance of the rule of law and a sound administration, is altogether misplaced and out of date. Dear Granddad, I never met you, and the family from the time I was a child never talked about you. Except once, Dad mentioned in passing that you had died in China in the 1940s, and for some reason had a monument built to you. I thought it was strange that you, having been born in Hong Kong, but then taken as a baby to Malaya, where you grew up, lived, and worked, would have died back in our ancestral village in China. Your father had left the village at the turn of the 20th century, along with a wave of migrant Chinese laborers headed for Southeast Asia, America, Australia, and Africa. Why did the family never talk about you in the 60 years since your death? Why does Grandma's gravestone not bear your name? 20 years ago, when I was going to be posted to China as a foreign correspondent for a newspaper, I pestered Dad and his older brother about you. They were reluctant to talk. One Chinese New Year on my visit home, my mom handed me a black and white photograph. The man in the photograph stood confidently, hands on hip. He was not tall, had a high forehead and thick lips, and a camera was slung around his neck. Another photographer in the family? I was intrigued. Eventually, oldest uncle coughed up a letter from his drawers. It was one of many letters relatives in our ancestral village had written to us over the past 60 years. But we never replied to them. The family wanted to forget you, forget China, and forget that chapter of history. I called the only phone number on the letter and introduced myself as your granddaughter. They thought I was lying and tested me by asking me to name your 5 children. I passed the test. On New Year's Day in 2011, I got on a bus in Hong Kong and rode 7 hours north to Meizhou City in southern China. I looked around the old town. Are these the same roads you walked? The same things you saw? I took a van back to our village, going past the jetty that great-granddad had left China from in the late 1800s, and the same steps you must have walked back up when you returned to China in the 1940s. I met our relatives. I found the house that great-granddad had built and where you had lived when you returned. I looked for traces of you and observed the rituals in this 100-year-old house where our relatives live, farm, gamble, and sometimes eat rats for breakfast. I asked them how you came back here in early 1949, in the final months of the civil war between the communists and the nationalists in China. I heard how you were chased down, surrounded, arrested, and jailed by the nationalists because you had joined a communist guerrilla army unit in our home village. I learned how you were eventually executed in July 1949 by the nationalists, just 2 months before the communists declared victory over China. Your side won the war, but all that remains of you is a monument in our village to your martyrdom. And this photograph, which the relatives handed to me as the only thing you had brought back with you from British Malaya. It was your prison photograph. It bears your detainee number. Your eyes seem to have lost the luster they once had. Painful as it was, oldest uncle began to open up. We found old family albums. In one picture, it looks like you were in your high school volleyball team. You were squatting in the front row, first from left, posing as if you were trying to keep that hairy mole on your left arm in the shadows. I now know that mole was how your body was identified from amongst the corpses in the mass grave you were left in after execution. I now know that in the 1930s, you had been a school principal and then a leftist journalist and photographer in Northern Malaya. You were a community leader. By all accounts, you were an advocate for social justice. Like most overseas Chinese who still cared for China, you and Grandma did theater in the streets to raise money for the anti-Japanese war in China. You were arrested and waterboarded by the Japanese for this. They hung you from a tree. You survived and continued being active in politics, culture, and intellectual circles. When the British returned after the war, you were part of a wave of anti-colonial sentiment. You made anti-British speeches. You became the chief editor of a leftist newspaper in Northern Malaya and published anti-British editorials. As the winds of the Cold War were blowing everywhere around the world, you were arrested by the British, who had declared emergency rule in Malaya as the communist-led resistance grew. The guerrillas in the dense jungles across Malaya sabotaged British rule and the tin and rubber supply that the British rely on from its prize colony. The British solution to this was to round up 35,000 leftists like you and deport you all to China, whether you had been born there or not. That's how you ended up in China. It was an all-out war in every way but name. The British called it the Malayan Emergency. It was a war that lasted 12 years and left families broken and traumatized. History is often written by the victors, and this trauma became buried with time in the bodies of my uncle and other families like ours. I wanted to understand this trauma, this amnesia. I wanted to understand you, the political choices you made, the fire you had in your belly. I traveled around southern China, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore to do oral histories with other leftists whose lives paralleled yours. They fought against the British and got deported or exiled. I met men and women now well into their 90s who were the foot soldiers of what they saw as a just national liberation revolution, like in so many other places in the Third World at the time. I asked them why they wanted the British out. I asked them what it was like being on those ships, being deported to China. I met many who were lucky, unlike you, and lived on to find good jobs in communist China. I met others who stayed on in Malaya and went into the jungles to fight to establish a communist state for the next 40 years, living in the rainforest between Malaysia and Thailand. They had their own field hospitals, radio station, printing press, and made their own weapons. They went on fighting for the idea and ideal of socialism, laying down arms only in 1989. Some remain exiled today in the jungles of southern Thailand. They have given their lives to a failed revolution. And most are now fading from the scene. I've driven around northern Malaysia and southern Thailand, in the towns where you had lived and worked, and in the so-called black areas where the communists were active, where they had ambushed Commonwealth soldiers, shot British rubber estate managers, where they had hid in limestone caves and lived with tigers and elephants in the jungles. I visited the old tin mines founded by the British and that jail where they had kept you. I went to the cemeteries of Commonwealth soldiers who were killed by the so-called bandits and communist terrorists. One of their graves reads, "One day we'll understand." In our family, this buried chapter of the Cold War left grandma and great-grandma to raise your 5 children without you. I feel I can understand the choices you made in those turbulent times of big politics. The family now thinks the genes skipped the generation and your sense of social purpose passed on to me. But grandma must have been very angry when she said you chose politics over family. And she must have been thoroughly heartbroken to lose you. She never remarried. One day, we might understand. By the time I was a teenager, there was no way to have a conversation with her. The grandmother I knew could barely make out who I was. Dementia had got her before I did. She was the white-haired elderly granny in traditional Chinese clothing, whom I saw on a few occasions each year. All I remember are stories of her wandering out of my oldest uncle's house where she had been staying and having to be found by the police. And that the family joked about how she was muddle-headed about every topic apart from money. Perhaps my being distant to her was also because among her 5 children, my father was the least close to her. Even today, he says she just didn't like him from the start. He was mostly raised by his grandmother, the strict mother-in-law grandma struggled with through her married and then widowed life. The scenes that remain in my mind fuzzy with time are those from her funeral. I was 17, took leave from high school to fly back to Penang, Malaysia with the rest of my paternal relatives. We wore white and beige clothes and marched with the hearse down the main street in front of the house she used to live in. We took the ashes to a temple at the foot of Penang Hill. I've been back to see her there several times since, but I hardly knew her when she was alive. The grandmother who emerges from the stack of defunct passports and photo albums I later found in my aunt's storeroom is a quite adventurous woman who traveled the world in her middle and old age. I flipped through pictures of her with a Hawaiian floral garland around her neck, and of her and a friend in front of the Lincoln Memorial or the Golden Gate Bridge, at a random 110-story building in New York City, by the Niagara Falls, and even at a statue in Taipei of Taiwanese leader Chiang Kai-shek, whose army executed her husband in 1949. I marveled at how she was more well-traveled than even me, and came to see her globe-trotting ways as a metaphor of sorts for her trying to make up for lost time, living out a life that was not fully fulfilled. These vacation photographs are here read against the grain and in tension with the fragments of memory from the interviews I did with her oldest son about her life before and after her husband's death. The graphically detailed, mostly poignant memories in his mind about her almost lifelong trauma are juxtaposed with a whole movie-like visual narrative I have constructed from her vacation photographs. Taken together, the photographs scattered across various albums in her children's storerooms, her scribblings in Chinese on the backs of the prints, and the date stamps in her passport breadcrumb a sketch of this part of the latter years in her life. From them, I reconstructed the chronology of her travels as now unfolded in this book. For years now, I've been obsessed with the story of my grandfather, how he was politically active in Malaya and China and eventually paid for it with his life. But that story is for the next book in the series. My first inkling that there was also something to the story of my grandmother was when I witnessed how her younger son wept uncontrollably in a public carriage of a train. We were on the way back from the extended family's first ever visit to our ancestral village in Guangdong, China, and to Granddad's grave in 2011. In a conversation on the train ride, I had perhaps quite simplistically asked, Why did Grandma never remarry? He wordlessly cried for what felt like a very long time. He might have been thinking about how she lived out her life alone after having lost her husband in her mid-30s. That, for me, was a hint at the depth of trauma that has silently sat within this family all these decades, and of the pain and loss my grandmother lived with. Towards the end of her life, another cruel, ironic twist of fate. The woman who tried so hard to forget her dead husband lost her memory to dementia. In the end, she was not even able to recognize her beloved youngest son who visited her daily at her care home in Penang until her death. With that, a chapter of the family's trauma perhaps found some closure. This retelling of parts of her story is intended not to reopen old wounds, but as a tribute to her fortitude and sacrifice, and to that of all the other women who, like her, suffered the fallout of colonialism and war.
起汉教课的奴隶，起来全世界的奴隶，满腔的热血已经沸腾着，最后什么斗争，旧社会把它融化流水。奴隶们起来，起来！莫要说我们所有，我们是天下的主人。噔噔滴噔哒滴啊！噔噔滴哒哒滴哒滴，噔噔。噔哒叮哒当，这是最后的斗争，团结起来到明天。International 就一定要实现，这是最后的斗争。团结起来到明天 International 就一定要实现，这是最后的斗争，团结起来到明天。International 就一定要实现。没错哦。第一条是了，我编好了，一条就够了。
Okay, I'll leave it there. So now.
Thank you, Chi Yin. Thank you for that beautiful and generous rendition of your work. It's there's so much to unpack there. It's yeah, it's kind of you know, I mean, since I like went through this, it was difficult not to be choked by that story of your grandmother. It's incredibly sad, but also, like you say in your reading, you know, the strength and fortitude throughout something that, you know, from an event that was particularly traumatic, is really to be sort of you know, inspired by, you know, that story. And I know it's a story that, you know, it is not uncommon. You know, when we look at that kind of aspect of history, I mean, you know, the global history from the 20th century, when we think of the kind of like upheaval of the world, you know, from, you know, the earlier world wars, but then also the kind of decolonization movements, the kind of ideological struggles, the Cold War, which, you know, normally we think of the Cold War as being something that was kind of fought between, or at least a lot of people think of the Cold War as being something that was fought between Russia and the US, for instance, you know, or Europe. Europe is something that exists around Europe, but it actually exists all over the world around at that time, you know, being a kind of like a struggle of, you know, capitalism versus socialism. But also, you know, how around that time a lot of decolonization movements, you know, the kind of process of decolonization is fully in effect at that stage, with imperial powers withdrawing from parts of the world, you know, in invoking, or, you know, the movement of people, the migration of people across continents. You know, the stage that when we look back now, you know, is incredibly a stage of turmoil, and trauma and change and displacement and wars and violence and all of these things. So much of that is embedded in this project on so many layers there. It's really great to see your work, you know, in that relation. But what I'd like to ask you first is, you know, you know, what's also evident in your work is the fact that you begin as a photographer, as somebody who's very active as a photographer working in a kind of documentary genre, or in a documentary way, and that somewhere along the line your attention turns towards the archival or photographs that already exist, and your attention focuses off from the capture of a moment or a place, and you know, the documentation of that, and then photographs become another vehicle in which to help tell your story. So I just wondered whether you could talk a little bit about your own development as a photographer, and where you find yourself today, especially today at a time when traditional ideas of photography have been challenged quite rigorously, but also the idea of how the archival or archives can be a place in which to sort of think about the past, and a site at which to kind of examine the past. All of that is embedded in your work. So yeah, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the background of your ideas and where they come from.
Yeah, thanks, Sunil. Uh, well, that's a big question. So maybe I'll take it in sort of like two main levels, I suppose. One is my own sort of trajectory from a more straightforward, you know, straight ahead kind of documentary photography practice into something a little more patched together and a bit all over the place. So I started out as a, you know, in my teens as a street photographer, and then became actually first a text journalist and a foreign correspondent, and then came back to photography and ended up doing a lot of editorial work, my practice was very firmly within the documentary realm, very much about going out there and making pictures of the world that we live in. You know, I was part of a couple of photo agencies. I'm still part of one right now, and I mean the kind of traditional beliefs in those agency settings is still very much about, you know, us having the responsibility of going out there and capturing reality and a piece of reality that we live with, and you know, making iconic pictures and that kind of thing. In the past few years, I became a little, I suppose you could say, more questioning of that, and maybe even a little bored of that. I began to think about how I could, you know, not contribute to this almost digital noise. I think there's still a need for people to go out there into the world, to do the sort of the first layer of you know, the writing of history, if you like, the journalistic type of work, which is, you know, your wire agency photographers, your New York Times photographers and all that. They can, I mean, they do that really well and all that, but I started to question my own role in this sort of like documenting the world that we live in. And I also became more interested in historical narratives, because I kind of feel very strongly that the contemporary politics that we see happening and unfolding around us have roots from a much earlier time. And if we don't reckon with those histories and those things in the closet, then I think we're always going to not be able to understand what we're seeing unfold in front of our eyes today. I mean, case in point, Afghanistan. You know, you might think, what has Afghanistan got to do with this war in British Malaya? In fact, Malaya became so strongly seen as a success story for the British in terms of counterinsurgency that it was written into the textbooks, the military textbooks of both the British and the Americans. And the counterinsurgency strategies that were used in Malaya were later on applied in the Vietnam War and applied in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So, you know, you might think that this war is like forgotten, you know, in a remote place, you know, who the hell knows where Malaya is? And not so many people died. It's not so famous like Vietnam. Nobody has any memory of this war unless you were a British serviceman that served in it. But you know, if you look carefully, there are echoes of it in what's happening and unfolding in Afghanistan right now in the past 2 weeks. So I became much more interested in, yeah, the history. I mean, I guess my own training is also in history. My first 2 degrees were in history, and my PhD right now is quite informed by historical, you know, work as well. So that is a kind of bias that I have, I suppose. I am interested in the long roots of things and how things today can be explained by looking a bit deeper at the historical threads that join contemporary and past. And then, of course, I became interested in the archive because at different levels as well, you know, the Colonial Archive, which I began my reading with, that's a more recent chapter of the work. And then what got me started in all this is the family archive, you know, digging into the family archive to try and figure out who was what and what happened and why certain things turned out the way it did. And as I said in the reading, you know, this whole thing started because I was curious about this grandfather that was somehow not spoken about, and you know, I was curious about why. Yeah, my dad and his siblings never spoke about him. There's not one photograph of granddad around the house, and he's not mentioned on grandma's grave tablet. And I mean, in my early 30s, actually, I became kind of interested in why this man was, you know, why did the family work so hard to try and erase this man from the family history? So that led me to that photograph of him with the camera. And then, of course, I was completely enamored of this man who was also a photographer. I was like, how can that be? You know, there's another photographer in the family, and I never knew about him. And he looks really cool. Who is this dude? And then I started digging and digging and digging, and I found more and more archival photographs of him, not necessarily taken by him. I can't prove anything was photographed by him. But yeah, I found tons of photographs of him at different stages of his life, and then just started to try and use that to build out some kind of narrative of his life. And then I became interested in the other people who were like him, of his generation, who fought the British on the anti-colonial side. And initially, it was a quest to sort of find people who might have known him, might tell me something about him. But then it became obvious that these people's stories had not been properly documented as well. So I took it upon myself to do 35 oral history interviews across 5 countries. It took me a number of years to do that. And I collected their portraits, their oral histories, and I also did a series where I photographed their objects and things that memorabilia that they collected from this war and around the time of deportation. And that itself became some kind of a counter archive of this war, because no archive of the losers of this war exists anywhere apart from, about 200 of them got resettled in southern Thailand because they couldn't return to Singapore or Malaysia. And those villages, they're called peace villages, they have little sort of cottage industry type museums where they have a collection of, hodgepodge of objects from the war. But otherwise, none of this exists in any museum or archive in Britain, in Malaysia or Singapore. So somehow, the stuff I collected, I didn't take the stuff away from them. I made just digital images of these things. But this is sort of like a digital counter archive of this war. So I came to see, my work as sort of like multiple layers of archiving. And even the landscape photography of the sites of memory around this war, I became interested in the idea that the landscape itself, the land itself, the territory itself could be some kind of an unspoken archive of this war. So working with this idea of the archive as a site, as you say, of investigation of the past, of a past that is somehow erased or forgotten or willfully hidden. And so that's how I approach my work now. I mean, there's a layer of it which is really just working with archival images and using that to make books, intervene with visually, make exhibitions with. And then another layer of it is sort of like looking at contemporary scenes mostly in the landscape, and then trying to photograph with a sense that there's a trace of the past, using the land itself as an archive of the past. So so that's where I'm at the moment.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I think one of the things that certainly in activating our archives, we've been sort of talking about or exploring is the idea of what an archive is. And thinking about the archive not only as a noun, or as thinking in terms of it being a repository of content that already exists, but archive as being a verb, to archive. So photography, classically is kind of a mode of archiving, a mode of collecting images ultimately. And as photographers or as image makers, we all by default turn into archivists as well of our own images. And and so I see, personally, I see the link between photography and archiving are much closer than one would imagine. And I mean, I think that one definite kind of question that I was been thinking about is how in which your work, you separate the two modes of working. So in one sense, your archive, you've been accessing your family's archive and thinking about the images that already exist in your world, or within the kind of the relationships that you have in your family. But also there is also the idea of images that you shoot and you actually collect and so I'm wondering about how you resolve in terms of making work or processing work, how you resolve one thing between another. This book is full of images of images that are collected from your family, whereas the project that you showed on screen, that was like an intermingling of both things. And so in terms of the kind of visual registers that are at play there, like how do you resolve what you use and how you use it?
I think that's always a tricky question because sometimes things become so multi-register, they become hard to put together. But I mean, I didn't have a really fully thought out strategy when I started doing this, and I mean that has itself been a problem. I think when I do workshops or mentoring these days, and people are doing this kind of multi-year, multi-chapter project, I try to persuade people to think about your intention from the beginning and try and collect things along those lines of intention, because otherwise you have a problem at the end of it. So for myself, I didn't. I was none the wiser when I started this, and so I have a hodgepodge of things that I try to sort of discipline into some kind of um, intelligible product that can have some kind of resonance for other people. So the way I've done it so far is just to show different pieces of it in different forms. So some pieces of it are suited more for a book, like the book that you have on grandma. That probably doesn't translate well into an exhibition, so that exists in a book form. And then in other cases, I've done solo exhibitions with, a certain piece of the work. For instance, the landscape series of the sites of memory around the war. I did a series. I did a show in Hong Kong in 2019 where it was basically anchored by the series of landscapes. So you feel sort of like you're in the atmosphere of this war, and there's something mysterious and surreal about these landscape pictures, but you don't really know what exactly happened in these sites. And that's often accompanied by a 2-channel video installation, which is one of the songs you heard just now in the International. And then there's a second song that plays as well. So I've used different pieces of this. They are of very different registers, and I've sometimes used just one piece of it on its own for one kind of product or output. And then sometimes I've used things in combination with one another. But it's true that they are so diverse that it's difficult to mesh into one piece sometimes. And that's also what drove me towards the performative reading, because I found that that is a form that I can use on stage that brings together these different threads. So just to give you a sense of how bad it is that I have material that is so diverse, I work with this book designer, Teun van der Heijden in Amsterdam. He's designed many award-winning books for a lot of photographers, and we've been working together for a number of years, and we intend to make 3 or 4 books from this series, from this project. And the fact is, I went to him to make one book, but because I kept finding new material, and because the material is so different one to the next, he couldn't find a way to put it all into one book. So he's decided he needs to make 3 or 4 books. So this is a measure of how terribly disorganized the material can get. And I think if I had been clearer in my head what I was doing from the beginning, I think I think the visual registers might be closer together or easier to mix. And even the video installation, I think if I had a clear idea of what the hell I was doing from the beginning, I think it would have been a much simpler kind of like artistic process from capture to presentation. But I think it's quite an individual decision as well for people who are working with a mix of archival and contemporary. Sometimes there are things that work well together, and sometimes things just have to stand on their own. If I can go back to a screen share, I can show you a little bit of what I mean. For instance, in the exhibition that we just in July opened in Arles, it's a solo show, focuses on the colonial archival interventions that I made. So I'm not sure if it's clear from the reading, but the very beginning of the reading, where you're seeing these archival pictures that look like collages, basically they are prints from the Imperial War Museum collection on Malaya that I've photographed against a very strong backlight, such that verso and recto of the prints are merged into one plane. And so in this, I'm trying to sort of unpack the indexing and indexicality of the archive, the colonial archive. I'm asking questions about how knowledges and historical historiography and histories are written, and how public memory is formed around certain wars, decolonization wars. So the Arles show focused on that new chapter of the work. It was the first showing of this work, but we chose to pair it with the landscape photographs. So you see here an installation view of a few walls that were in this exhibition. So you see the, the very sepia toned brown stuff, and then you see bang, a big, a square landscape. And that's one of the contemporary landscapes that I made in Malaysia. And so, and southern Thailand. And so, we chose to do this because there is some kind of a conversation that happens when you do this, when you mix not just visual registers, but do this kind of temporal shift, of archival and contemporary. We could have just done a hang of all the archival pictures. I mean, that would probably have worked as well. But something else interesting happens when you start to mix them. And I think, different questions start to emerge. And of course, you have to do these pairings and sequencing quite carefully and thoughtfully. It's not a random thing at all. So yeah, for instance, that biggest wall that you see there is a piece of river that was known as like a river of blood during this war. A lot of killings on both the communists and on the British ends. So, and it has some specific memories for my family because it was a river that was very close to my grandfather's hometown, and it was where my great-grandmother had suicidal thoughts of just going and lying down in this river when she went to visit him in jail, after visiting him in jail. And she was so despairing of his fate to be, that she wanted to go lie down in this water. So, so then we decided to put this piece of river in the middle of other imagery of the terrain, the territory, the white bodies fighting the yellow bodies and brown bodies in this landscape. So then, other questions emerge when you mix these registers and yeah. So that's sometimes how I choose to sort of mix them.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, something that comes to my mind about this is the kind of problematizing history, because in a sense, when we look back in time and we try to understand or interpret what happened in the past, and we go to all these different places, we speak to people, we speak to we do our research, we find contradictions, we find that looking back to history isn't a smooth, even process, but something that's full of conflict, tension, difficulty, hard work, good stories, bad stories, and I think that one of the things that often the way in which the past is packaged is that it's packaged under the kind of romantic or the mythological, or packaged in a way that's offered to us in a way that can be understood, which is completely fine. So I don't have an issue with that. But I think also there needs to be space in which to problematize history. And I think that in merging these kind of visual registers, sometimes it helps to kind of allude to that kind of difficulties of like saying something, with complete, I don't know, with a complete and absolute kind of knowledge,
authority. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that that's one way in which to do that. But also, I mean, you must have in doing this work come across a difficulty in working out how to retell the story, and accepting that your subjectivity is embedded within that, and that what this isn't is some sort of authoritative history. I mean, I know it's important to provide counter histories, but we want to first of all problematize histories that exist already, that are circulated in public consciousness, but at the same time we want to offer counter histories, but counter histories that problematize the telling of histories in the first place. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but
yeah, no, I hear you. Yeah. No, I mean, it's certainly something that's very much on my mind all the time, because I mean, my starting point or my overall intention in doing this years-long project is really to try and get people to ask questions of the official narratives that we have been given. In the post-colonial states, of Singapore and Malaysia, they basically inherited the colonial storytelling of this story, which is that there was a very successful smashing of the communist insurgency. They were a bunch of bandits, and they were, influenced by or helped by the Soviet Union and China, and they wanted to create a red Malaya, and so I think those histories need to be reckoned with. I mean, you would be familiar, or the audience will be familiar with the fact that the Brexit vote from a few years ago was not completely divorced from this lack of reflection on its Britain's colonial past. I mean, Britain, when you look at surveys that people have done in former colonial countries, Britain always comes up near the top in terms of feeling positive about its colonial past. So I think there's many more questions to be asked about that past, and many more different perspectives to put into the narratives and the historiography that we are given on these wars. So I see myself as someone who's part of this wave of people, artists, intellectuals looking at how to problematize and how to contest and challenge and poke holes at these official narratives that we're given. But of course, I'm very aware of my own subjectivity, and I don't at any point say that I have the authoritative version of this story. I, in fact, in some exhibitions have just put basically contradictory pieces of text about this war on the wall or on a table. Wow. For people to realize that there is just there's no one truth about this war or any war. I mean, it's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of whether you were on the losing or winning side. I mean, we have to remember that the people who managed to inform our public memory of these wars are the people who were powerful, who had cameras, who had journalists, who had the machinery to create information around what was unfolding contemporaneously. So in fact, in doing this chapter of the work, which I call Interventions, I was very frustrated to have to use the colonial masters' material to try and re-narrate this war. Because when I went into the Imperial War Museum archive, my primary interest was actually to look for representations of the yellow and brown bodies who fought the British. But I mean, maybe that was a naive intention from the beginning, because obviously this is the British military archive. The photographs were taken for either one of two things: one, propaganda; two, military intelligence. So, I mean, what was I expecting, right? I mean, I couldn't have expected to find many visual representations of the yellow and brown bodies that fought this war, really. I mean, that was really naive. I mean, of course, what I found were many, many, many pictures of the triumphant white body smashing the yellow and brown bodies, which were, fighting colonial rule. So it frustrated me to have to use the colonial archive imagery to try to re-narrate this war. So in this show, what I did was I picked pictures that were a little ambiguous about whose bodies you're looking at. So the bodies are very small, they're very obscure in the frame, or they're backs of bodies, or there's like a plume of smoke, or there's fog or something. So I mean, it's a no-brainer if you think about it. This is the British military propaganda photography collection. So it's bound to be white bodies that you're witnessing. But I wanted to sort of introduce a little ambiguity and doubt in that. And the way we sequenced the hang as well, it sort of deals with the terrain and the territory first, and then you start to make sense of like whose bodies are you actually looking at. And then the one main sort of counterweight to the dominance of the colonial archive in this show was that I used a 2-channel video and sound installation. So the two songs sung by the actual anti-colonial guerrilla fighters actually flood the entire room. So it's really hard to convey to you what that feels like, because you're just looking at still installation views of this exhibition. But when you step into this room, actually even before you step into this room, you hear this, elderly Chinese person singing these songs. So they're there to sort of represent the counter voice, the counter archive there. in their own voice, literally. But it is an imperfect thing that, you know, even in trying to re-narrate this war from an anti-colonial or decolonial or post-colonial perspective, I have to resort to using the visual material that exists, which is the Colonial Archive.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't see a huge problem in that either, because I think that in some respects there's something symbolic about that, about you know, of Malayan heritage going into that archive now and reappropriating those images for your own purposes to retell the story from the perspective of your family's background. So I think that there is something very quite powerful in doing that. And, you know, the fact that you've been allowed to do that, you know, that you've gained access into this archive, you know, is particularly, I think, you know, subversive and challenging to this kind of notion of existing knowledge that surrounds this kind of colonial past. You know, so I think absolutely it's quite right that you do that, but also then you're able to frame it. I'm not so sure about, you know, any curator who would then add, you know, like caveats to the to the history that you're telling by, you know, like presenting, you know, what another perspective, because very likely that perspective might be informed by, you know, the idea of, you know, some sort of objectivity which we know doesn't exist, but that coming from actually a you know, from a legitimate, in inverted commas, source, you know, of that history. Whereas I think that when an artist or, you know, someone like you comes into this space, you know, you're able to sort of look back at that history with fresh eyes, in a sense, you know. The other thing being that because of your journalistic past, that you also bring in an ethics, you know, into this space. You know, it's not purely about you and your feelings about this, although these are embedded very strongly in the work, but it's also about you providing this history some degree of integrity of like what, you know, the voices that exist within, you know, and you can't look at or you can't hear those singing voices without feeling that, you know, that weight of that history, you know, in those voices. So I think it's very powerful indeed.
Yeah, so obviously there is affect in my work, right? Especially the singing is definitely, you know, appealing to the affect, but the affective. But yeah, I mean, because of my background, you know, in history and in, you know, in with my work in scholarship and my journalistic training, I suppose there is something investigative still about the way I work, and I definitely don't. I'm not working in a fictive space, and I'm not really taking leaps between facts. I'm basically just going as far as to say that that there are multiple versions of this past, and there are multiple voices that have been erased or muted in this telling, and I'm trying to sort of give these voices and perspectives space to exist alongside the mainstream narratives that we know. So it's not a very radical position to take at all. In terms of getting access to this archive to do this, I guess I should say that, you know, it wasn't as if I was invited by the Imperial War Museum to intervene with their archive. I had approached them, just the backstory, just for your background. I had approached them as a PhD candidate at King's College London War Studies, which I am in theory. I mean, yeah. So they took me in as a researcher, and the expectation of a researcher usually is that you just use the materials for research, and you know, at most you would take like phone photographs of what you're seeing for note-taking purposes, and that's it. But when I started to look at their photographic archive on Malaya, I realized that there were things that I felt very excited by. I mean, there were pictures that I'd never seen before, and there were definitely representations that of the war and its combatants that I felt were important to document in more than a phone snap kind of way. So I actually renegotiated. I was there was a 6-month period when I wasn't able to work in the archive, and I spent that time sort of negotiating my way back in as an artist. And I told them that, you know, I started to do these interventions. I was messing around with it, and I discovered this way of, you know, photographing the prints that merged back and front, and sort of really looked at deconstructing what is an archive, what are those index numbers, what are those wax pencil writings, markings, captions, what are those bits of caption paper and dried glue and things like that. So I became interested in it aesthetically as well as, you know, theoretically. So I wrote them and I explained what exactly I was doing, and it took a fair amount of lobbying, but there were 3 curators in the end that helped me get back into the archive and to sort of complete my look at this entire collection. So I've looked at all the photographs in the Imperial Museum archive to do with British Malaya, and I think I'm told by the archivists there that nobody else has ever looked at this whole collection like this. And it's to be fair, the Imperial Museum was excited that there was somebody interested in this small and remote war in the first place, because Malaya is not a war that is, you know, paid much attention to at all. I mean, even the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, I think, gets a bit more attention and you know, cachet these days than Malaya. Malaya is sort of like this, yeah, forgotten, unimportant, not so many people died kind of war. Yeah, so that's the context of this latest chapter of the work, which I did out of the Imperial Museum archive.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the idea of archives often being under the kind of guard of these institutions, you know, I mean, it's very true. It's not always easy to gain access to this stuff, you know. When you do gain access, you have to kind of be legitimate, so to speak, from, you know, another organization. You know, you have to have a, you know, the correct credentials to gain, you know, access to this material. And then once you're there and you're actually doing that work, then you've got to kind of bear in mind the provenance of the images, you know, if you're going to use them anywhere else, whether they need to be credited, you know, all of that kind of stuff. You know, where I come from in terms of this kind of material is that it's, you know, it should be open season to do anything you want with it, you know. I mean, I'm not talking about ripping it up or anything, but I'm saying, you know, to rephotograph it, to, you know, manipulate it, to kind of adjust its kind of meanings and its kind of semiotics in ways that you know, an artist would want to do. So that,
Yeah.
you know, I like the idea of, like, you know, the archive is only being the starting point for what might be done
Mm-hmm.
to its kind of meaning and context and interpretation. But
unfortunately, I think we still live in a time when there is a lot of talk about decolonizing archives here and there, but I think many archives are still kind of frightened of opening up for this kind of reinterpretation. In fact, the Imperial War Museum archivist who's been the most helpful to me over the years told me that she had gotten some feedback from people who saw the show in Arles, other curators that she knew from other parts of Europe. And one of them sent her an email and said, "Oh, how brave of the Imperial War Museum for letting this artist in to do this to your archive." So I mean, there's still this perception that, you know, it should be guarded, and it's important in terms of informing public memory and historiography around, you know, the histories that we know, and therefore, you know, what are you doing manipulating these images like that? So there's still that sense, I think, with lots of institutions.
Yeah, by all means, it's not an easy task. Before I mean, I do want to ask you a couple more questions about the kind of circulation of your work. But before we do that, I'm just going to make a note, just to sort of let everybody know that's on the call, like, please, if you've got any questions for Chi Yin, then add them to the Q&A or even add them to the chat. We're gonna come to get to you very soon. And I know that there will be some questions from people who are kind of attending today. So please do add them, and then I'll take a look as soon as I can. But one thing I wanted to ask you, Chi Yin, is the kind of, you know, the importance of counter narratives and how within the kind of Malayan community, you know, especially with a past that hasn't been discussed much, you know, that there isn't, other than memorials, there's not much kind of circulation of those histories. There's always a danger that those histories get lost. You know, I note that there's a lot of, in your presentation, that there are people that are passed on now. You know, the stories are kind of are no longer there, you know, to be kind of like resurrected. So I wonder, you know, like what within the kind of Malayan community or within the country, what possibilities are there for you as an artist to kind of, you know, to kind of enter that space with, you know, the ability to show your work, with the ability to have your work discussed within kind of communities? Is there much scope for that, or is it quite difficult? Because I mean, it's great having your work in art, and I really respect that. That's fantastic that it's been sort of you know, accepted in the kind of high spaces of art that we know. But you know, what is there? What scope is there for this work to do some work within communities in Malaya?
Yeah, no, point well taken. So this is also a question that I kind of grapple with a fair amount, because I mean, I come from Singapore, so I think Malaysia is a slightly different case in that I think civil society is a little more active there, and there's a bit more room to breathe. But having said that, this history is a little more contentious in Peninsular Malaysia than in present-day Singapore, because most of the fighting did happen in Malaysia, and in Malaysia you would still confront you know, ex-servicemen whose families were killed by the communists. So you know, it's still a very touchy and emotive subject, and in many ways quite explosive, contested history. There is a sort of small movement amongst filmmakers, younger historians, artists, performance makers in Malaysia and Singapore to relook this history. So I'm really working in context of this cohort of people who are challenging these official narratives. It remains difficult in some ways to really talk to a big public about this topic, because both the Malaysian and Singapore states narratives are very, very hegemonic. They're very, very clear about who was right and who was wrong, and who has the right to speak about this history. So it remains difficult to speak in sort of like the political and the civil society space. So this is where I think art actually provides some kind of way in to a difficult topic in what I call a relatively closed society, because it's not it's not Britain. You can't just talk about it, and there is no politician that will be left of center that will take this up in Parliament for review and whatnot. I mean, the founding narrative of the current party that rules Singapore and has ruled it since 1959 is anti-communism. So there's no way you're going to rewrite this narrative officially. There's also no way you can take it. You can't go head on with the state at a high level. But I think through the little exhibitions, through the little performative readings, I think you can see questions in people's minds, in the younger generation's minds about this past, and sometimes I think you can't be in a hurry for these changes to happen. So it's about this kind of slow seeding of questions and doubts in people's minds about the version of history that they're given. I've been in and of course I'm doing this in multiple ways. The performative reading that I did for you just now is being turned into a full-length hour-long performance for a theatre. That's something that I'm working with a dramaturg and director on, and probably to premiere in 2024. And I mean, that's at the invitation of the National Theatre in Singapore. So there is some appetite for this kind of retelling, but sort of within the art space. Because that's seen as somehow having more latitude. I think you can also do it within the academic space. I mean, because you're seen as part of being part of this ivory tower. You don't have mass reach. The problem usually comes when the artistic pieces that have been banned that question this history have usually been films, because they're more frightened of the mass distribution and the mass reach of films.
Yeah.
So my work hasn't really been censored on this in Singapore. But the people who have made films questioning the official history on this war have actually been banned in both Malaysia and Singapore. So I think there are ways to chip away at the armor of the official historiography. You just have to keep at it. There's a theatre maker in Malaysia, Mark Tay. He has been working on the Malayan War and questioning the narrative for, I think, more than 10 years. And what he's done is he does different pieces, different performance pieces, and he's actually taken it to different schools, football clubs, small film societies. So he keeps doing the performance in different iterations in different settings. And then he has like discussion groups around these histories. So I think this is probably the only way to work in societies that don't officially welcome a diverse debate, diverse politics, which is what we are dealing with in terms of Malaysia and Singapore. So the other part of my kind of hope is that we can have these conversations in Britain, in the former metropole. And I've been curious to find out actually how much appetite there is in Britain to discuss this war and what the British did in this war. I mean, it's still early days, but and I think there's been some interest on the part of one or two institutions in this work, but so far I haven't really felt that there's been a huge interest or appetite on the part of the British institutions. But it could just be that I haven't really come into contact with that many British institutions, so that this is like a real assessment of whether there's an appetite or not. But yeah, I mean, one big wish of mine is that we could have these discussions with the British public. I think these histories need to be reckoned with, both in the former metropole and in the former colonies.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it does go to show how the power still resides in, I mean, these histories aren't that old, but also that power still resides within kind of like the political economy, whether it's here or in Singapore or Malaysia, anywhere really. And organizations are a little bit kind of wary of challenging the official line, the official line being the story that's accepted by historians, and the one that's accepted by nations as being their part of their kind of part of their past and part of their kind of accepted histories, and that I would say that I agree with you completely that despite this kind of talk of like decolonization, talk of challenging colonialism, there is very little there's very little evidence of actually doing that in practice, with kind of open debate about it, or at least even finding ways in which these kind of stories can be aired to a much bigger audience than the kind of, I mean, we speak to, when we present stuff in the art world or within photography circles, we're pretty much preaching to the converted often, people that already accept the fact that these things are problematic.
Yeah. No, and sometimes I think it's the case that other countries are more comfortable to talk about other people's colonialism than their own. So, there's a lot of interest in the performative reading, say in Amsterdam, when I did it there. There was a lot of interest in New York. I mean, every time someone is left crying, at the end of the performative reading. So there's resonances that people find. And I think, maybe it's sort of like my neighbors, bad deeds are easier to talk about than my own in some cases. So let's hope that there is scope to have these real discussions in both the former colonies and the former metropole eventually. But I mean, this is also my sort of attempt to, I mean, my sort of current mode of getting different pieces of this work out in different forms. The grandmother book could be, as I've been saying to other people, the story can be as small or as big as you wish for it to be. It could just be a story of my grandmother and her crazy travels around the world, or it could be, the story of a Cold War widow and the trauma that she lived with. So it you know, it can be spun in different ways, and so it innocently looks like, and to be fair, I did get a small grant from the National Arts Council in Singapore for that grandmother book. So it's, you know, certainly it's the state giving me a small piece of the funds that I needed to publish this book. So, but you know, I had to be careful in hedging how I wrote the application. You know, I made it seem very sort of a bit small bore, you know, a bit sort of just a story of my grandmother. I didn't sort of make it into a big sort of, you know, geopolitical issue. Then it gets into troubled territory.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the approach, isn't it? Is that you know, often it's art and literature and these kind of platforms which allow you to say a lot by you know, saying very
by
little.
Going like this.
Looking at it from a different perspective. Chi Yin, we got a few questions, so I just want to get to those if we can. Anya's asking, could I ask what texts you used in the first set of images of your presentation? There were archival sepia tone images with some text in the background. What made you add it to the images, and how important is the viewer? How important is it that a viewer, or maybe is not, able to read them? And I think that's, she's referring to the Imperial War Archive images.
So let me explain that a little further. So those images are actually, maybe I should go back to that.
Please do.
Let me just go back to that. So those images, I did not, when I say interventions, I just mean interventions in the multiple, you know, multiple meanings of that word. I mean, this is just me sort of intervening with the colonial representation of this war. I did not add anything to the images. So I did not do the different colored writings that you're seeing through the images. Those are actually original markings on the prints that exist in the Imperial War Museum collection on Malaya. And what I did was I basically photographed with a very strong backlight such that the markings on the backs are visible on the front, you know, on the front plane of the picture. So I made these, I guess, I compressed front and back of the prints into one plane in camera, and in doing that, I don't necessarily want you to be able to read the texts, because the texts themselves are not unproblematic. I mean, obviously they're written by colonial staff members, and the language and vocabulary that they use, the nomenclature that they used on certain people, is probably not entirely PC in our time. And so I've reappropriated some of that text to use in other ways in exhibition form, but I don't actually mean for you to be able to read the text. So the markings are not done by me. The markings were original markings. So in some cases, the blue wax pencil was often the archivist's wax pencil, and the red wax pencil was the censor's wax pencil. So there would be, you know, different sort of levels of encoding. And then you see different running numbers, serial numbers. Because I was interested in the idea of how these images, you know, circulated, how they were, first of all, made. The photographs were made in this war, and then they were printed, obviously, and then they were given certain types of indexing, and how they entered into various archives, and how they ended up in the Imperial War Museum archive, and how they sort of form the memory and historical knowledge that we have around this war. So the markings are all original markings. I didn't do anything to them, but it does ask questions of legibility and illegibility in the way that I've kind of re-photographed them. And in this case, for instance, it's a negative that I've made into a positive. And in fact, in the latest show that I'm opening in 2 weeks here in Berlin in the gallery, we've actually chosen to print some of these on glass. So we've turned, you know, we've turned these positives back into, you know, almost like glass negatives now. So I'm just playing with this idea of this transference as well, of, you know, going from negative to positive and sometimes back. And I'm, you know, sort of playing with this idea of transparency and legibility. And by doing it on glass, in fact, yes, you can actually turn it around and read the text if you want to. But I'm leaving that as an open kind of question. And if the person who buys this glass plate chooses to display it the other way around, then that's their choice. If they want to read the text not in reverse, for instance, in this particular picture, which was a very striking one for me when I first saw it in the archive, you can't probably read that blue word up there backwards, but it says bandits. And a curator that I was working with on this show at one point whipped out her pocket mirror and held it up against the picture, and then she could read the text. So she was really eager to read the text, so she whipped out her mirror and did that. But I don't necessarily want people to be able to read that, because the word bandits is very problematic in describing these people. So, and then there are other codes that are within this particular image. For instance, you see a kind of like a black pencil outline of the knees and the shoes, the boot and all that. This suggests that this picture was circulated to the press at the time for, obviously for propaganda purposes. So, I mean, then also questions about circulation of these images come into play too. So these are the sorts of questions that I'm trying to spark, I suppose, from doing this kind of gesture with the colonial photograph. This next photograph, it's stuck now, but the next photograph that you saw a peek of just now of this man post-mortem on a ladder, that photograph, actually that one, that is not from the Imperial War Museum archive. That is one that is from the Malaya War, but was bought on eBay. So again, this brings into question, the circulation, distribution of these images and these memories. And I put this in the exhibition because I wanted to sort of register the fact that there were multiple violences in this war. There's the violence of the killing, and there's the violence of putting this man on a wooden ladder and putting him against the wall and photographing him post-mortem with a clipboard with the name of his town and the kill number and the year in which he was killed. And then there's the violence of, somehow storing this image somewhere and somehow it ends up on eBay for purchase, So there's these sorts of questions of the multiple violences that happen to some of these photographs as well that I want to raise.
Okay, we've got John asking, I wonder about the need to restage individual narrative, even as counter to official history. I say this because of the levels of mediation of the familial storyteller. And so I wonder if the researcher might be the narrator as a purposeful depictor of a fictive narrative rather than as a historian.
No, I think that's entirely possible. But my background is in history, and I haven't done anything fictive so far, but I'm not opposed to it. I think I'm slowly beginning to open up to the more speculative, imaginative kind of space, and I'm not totally opposed to doing something fictive. And that might be the case when I do the performative, the full-length performance in the end. I think this project still has many chapters and iterations to come. I don't think that's entirely out of the picture. I have been invited by a book publisher to write a novel around this project, around my grandfather's life. But for the moment, I'm doing what I know how to do and what I have the training to do, which is still sort of being fairly respectful of the document, and although not trusting in the document as pieces of evidence necessarily, but respecting the oral histories and the documents for what they are, and presenting them quite unembellished to the viewer.
Yeah, Mike is asking, in the archival photos, are the identities of the communists listed, or are they depicted or recorded as just being anonymous enemy fighters? I wonder if there's any desire to or ability to connect the people depicted to contemporary descendants. Good question.
Yeah, that is something that I was looking out for when I went into the archive, and what I discovered, I guess, again, it was maybe naive to believe otherwise, but no, they have no names at all. They're just generic bandits. And even the British service dogs have names. There's Ginger, the Labrador, but the enemies have no names at all. And here you can see they were not named, they were numbered. This is number 5/51. I'm not authoritative on this, but from my research and from other things that I've seen, my interpretation of this number 5/51 suggests that this is kill number 5 of 1951 in this specific town of Kuantan, which is a part of East Malaysia. And so they were numbered, they were not named. And if they were named, I've seen some diaries where people wrote about there were some diaries kept by Commonwealth soldiers about their exploits in British Malaya, and they gave them nicknames. So they called, such and such a person the gorilla, or such and such a person, something else. They had code names for them, but and I think when they're wanted persons, then yes, they were named because of intelligence purposes, and they were all their various nicknames and war names were also listed. Their aliases were also listed. But by and large, I've not seen a single enemy fighter in the Colonial Archive being named.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's
whether that's common, of course, yeah. Whether I've attempted to connect them with contemporary descendants, no, it's too difficult. That's just, yeah. I mean, I have shown some pictures to some people that I've interviewed, but I mean, this war is so long over, and yeah, I haven't been able to find. I haven't been able to ID anyone specifically in any of the colonial photographs that I've seen. And in any case, there are very, very few representations of the enemy within the Colonial Archive, which is what I found. What I showed in ARL is the majority of what I found, which is not a lot at all. I mean, there were thousands of photographs from this war, and probably I saw the enemy less than a dozen times. So that gives you a sense of the proportion.
Dave is asking, how have you considered presenting the other side of the piece? My father was sent to Singapore to do his national service. He probably didn't even know why he was there.
Yeah, I have I have used pieces of text to represent some of those experiences. Yes, most of them were national servicemen, and that it's not to say that they were malicious, colonial people trying to smash the locals. I mean, I think the overall picture is that this was a war, and it was brutal on both sides, and it's definitely more complex than the official narrative gives us. So yes, I've used memoirs, I've used quotes from colonial archives as well to represent the sort of perspective of especially the foot soldiers on the British side too. But I haven't tried to take it upon myself. I did think about when I arrived in the UK in 2018 to do the PhD, I did think about whether I should make the project about the perspectives of the foot soldiers on both sides of the war. But I came down on the side of not doing that, because I think the British soldiers have already been able to tell their own story in memoirs, in novels, in other things that circulate in the cultural world. So I don't think it was my place to really try and retell their story. But I have used pieces of text where I can in exhibition form.
Yeah. Okay. Anya is asking, are there any images of women in the archives of the war?
In the Colonial Archive, not, but there are a few other pictures that I've seen or collected, which show women fighters. There were many women on the left who fought in this war alongside the men. There are very few pictures, but they exist. I mean, the women warriors the women fighters, guerrilla fighters. They're few and far between, but I've seen a few of them in fatigues. probably from the late 70s or the 1980s, just before the Malayan Communist Party army laid down arms in 1989. And then the other stuff I've seen is of former guerrilla fighters in prison. So there are pictures of them in prison as well. Most of it in personal collections, not in the Colonial Archive.
Yeah. And finally, we've got a question from Tim who's saying, I wondered how you think our future selves will be able to access and interpret the future archives which are being made now with their multiple sources and multiple truths.
Oh, okay. Crystal balling. I think it'll be more complex because right now, at least if we're working with a history like I am, there is, you know, kind of more or less the official narrative. And then there is, you know, the counter narrative that you can go collect. And the sources of the official narrative are quite defined, right? The official newspapers, the official archives. I think in the future, it's going to be much more complex because there's so many more sources of information, good and bad, today. So I think there's no sort of front page that chaperones all this information for us anymore. So I think it's going to be very complicated for sure. And I think there is, to some extent, a dilution of, you know, this notion of truth or good information or some kind of consensus on what's right and wrong or what's good and bad. So I think it's going to be definitely much more complicated in the future in terms of both the content and the sourcing. I don't think I'll be able to predict how one can go about interpreting. Yeah, I mean, there's so many additional questions, right? I mean, the information that we have today, a lot of it exists in a digital form, and whether we'll be able to even read some of this video, photographs, text information in the future, or how far into the future will we be able to, you know, put all this stuff into a computer and still be able to read it? I mean, that itself is a question. And digital archiving is full of questions. So I don't have a good answer for that, but I think it will be definitely a much more complex undertaking.
Absolutely, I think I agree with that answer, Chi Yin. I'd just like to say thank you to you for this excellent conversation. Really enjoyed hearing about your work and your thoughts and ideas. I love your book. This is incredible. Definitely a lovely piece of work. I congratulate you on it.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing the other two versions. Well, you've got a show at the moment, haven't you? It's at in Berlin.
Yeah, it hasn't opened yet. It's in 2 weeks' time. I'm scrambling to try and finish the last bits of text right now. Yeah, it opens on September 11th, strangely enough. Yeah, exactly 2 weeks from now. And it focuses on the interventions work. But there will be a table full of text as well with contradictory accounts of this war. So yeah, from both sides, I'll be doing something of a mashup of the tellings of this war.
Lovely. Well, you know, if you do get a chance, everybody just do sort of dig into Chi Yin's work a bit more and follow her progress. So yeah, I just wanted to finally say that Activating Our Archives is kind of running right now. It's live. So if there's anybody who wants to participate in the program, obviously we're limited on numbers that can actually attend the workshops, but you're very welcome to sort of contact Creative Learning at modernartoxford.gov.uk, I think it is. Let me just double check that for you. The address is Creative Learning at modernartoxford, all one word, .org.uk. If you drop us an email to say you're interested, then we may be able to add you to our Padlet so that you can contribute your images to that and also have the group respond to your content. Additionally to that, the hashtag on Instagram, hashtag activating our archives, is there. You know, add any images that you want, post the hashtag on your images, and it will come up on the hashtag feed. And it's great to have everybody so interested in it this year, and I'm hoping good things for it. So I think that's all from us today. Thank you, Chi Yin, again. Thank you, Kieran.
Thank you, Sunil. Yeah.
Arts and Modern Art Oxford, and thank you all for joining us. We'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Yeah. Bye-bye.